Hello! Today we are talking about a video stuttering, freezing, and stopping issue with the iPhone 15 Pro writing to external SSD. The most important thing, I will tell you the bottom line up front in case you really need to go and have other things to do, is to keep them at the right optimal operating temperature. With the iPhone, according to the Apple website, that's between 0 degrees Celsius and 35 degrees Celsius. If your iPhone or iPad gets too hot or too cold, use iOS and iPadOS devices where the ambient temperature is between 0 degrees and 35 degrees. Low or high temperature conditions might cause your device to change its behavior to regulate its temperature. Using an iOS or iPadOS device in very hot conditions can permanently shorten battery life. And the iPhone will heat up to something like 49 degrees Celsius if you don't cool it, while recording 4K 60 ProRes video. So you can use a phone cooler, problem solved. But there is a similar story, but more complicated with the SSD. You can't just cool. You don't want it to be as cool as possible, you want it to be as optimal as possible, somewhere between 20 degrees Celsius and 29 degrees Celsius. So what you might want to do is put some sort of a piece of paper or something between the cooling fan and the SSD so that it doesn't overcool it. You want to cool but not overcool, or else the SSD will stop working until it heats up again. Please also do keep in mind you will need a separate power adapter for the fan, because if you use a USB-C hub, it might not power the fan. And in the absence of a cooling fan, just a regular room fan should work just as well. Alright, so that was the long story short, and now I will go into the details of how I arrived at these conclusions. The first thing I did after making my previous video on this channel is I wanted to try two things. My previous video focused on footage from the Cars on the Road series. And that was fine, there was some motion, but I wanted to really stress test the system to put a lot of load on the iPhone, on the storage. So I went on the GoPro YouTube channel and I took the footage from there. It's already moving a lot, but I went a step further and I sped it up by 2 times. So that way there is a lot of motion. And I pointed the camera at the TV as last time. And this time I also needed to check, I will need to record a 2-hour event soon, so an hour and a half, as I determined with a 1 terabyte is not going to suit me. So I needed to check with a 2 terabyte SSD to see how long can you record on a 2 terabyte SSD. To my surprise, when I came back to check on the iPhone, it was not recording anymore, it was just stopped. And I was like, why did it stop? The storage was not full, and it stopped. So was there some sort of an error message that I was supposed to see that I missed? Okay, well, that failed, so I tried again. And I was trying out recording in HDR this time, and I put a camcorder in front of the iPhone. And so that way I was able to capture what is on the iPhone screen so that if there is an error message, I can later come back and see the video of what the message was. Turns out what happened was the first 10 minutes were flawless. It recorded well, but after 10, 15, 17 minutes, the video started to stutter. It would just show fine and then it would freeze. And then it would unfreeze and keep playing. The audio would keep playing, the audio was smooth, but the video would freeze, and sometimes for a few seconds at a time, until finally, like an hour and a half into the video, or maybe an hour into the video, something long like that, it would finally freeze one last time, and this time it would stay frozen for 10 seconds, and then the iPhone would just stop recording. And there is no error message, nothing. It just stopped recording, and that's it. Okay, not that the video footage would be useful if it didn't stop recording anyway, because, see, this is what it looks like. It stutters, it stops, freezes a lot. Well, and this happens in both HDR and log video formats. As you can see, this is the log format recording, and it does the same thing. It starts to stutter, and then it stops recording eventually. Now here's an observation though. At the beginning of the video recording, the video recorded just fine and the phone was still room temperature. But as time went on, the temperature of the phone rose, the temperature of the SSD rose, and the video started to freeze and stutter. Well, could be there any correlation? In the case of the phone, that was about 49 degrees Celsius. In the case of the SSD, that went up to 41 degrees Celsius. And so my first hypothesis, because the phone was hotter, so maybe the phone is the problem because it's hotter. I went online and found a phone cooler to use. And please note on overcooling the phone. If you use the cooler when the phone is not doing a lot of operations, you might overcool the phone and form condensation inside the phone. So just be aware of that. Here's a little note from one of these sellers. Please disconnect the power when the phone is not in use to prevent potential malfunctions caused by low temperatures. Obviously, not all of the sellers will tell you that warning. Most will just say, hey, here's a great product, it'll solve all your problems, but you have to read the fine print. The first thing I tried, just because it's convenient, I knew this might not work because it's only 14 watts of power output. I wasn't sure what the wattage is on the fan, but I plugged it into the USB-C hub and I turned the fan on and it would blink a green light and immediately turn off. So that meant that the USB-C hub wasn't providing enough power. So then I took a laptop power adapter, 65 watts, and I plugged the cooling fan into that, and that worked. The fan turned on and it cooled. I measured just by itself without putting it on the phone yet, the surface over here of the fan, it went down to about -1 degree Celsius, and then I didn't keep waiting to see if it'll go down lower or not. But the point was, it does cool. So I set all this up, I put the fan on the phone to try to solve the problem now, started the recording, it all worked, and maybe 10 or 15 minutes later, it started stuttering again. The video started freezing. Wah, wah. So much for that idea. Okay, so I took the fan off the phone, and instead I held it on the SSD drive. And after a couple minutes, the video stopped stuttering. So hey, my initial hypothesis was incorrect, that it was the phone causing the problem. But it turns out the SSD was starting to slow down as it heated up. Well, great! So the next experiment, I let the phone cool down, the SSD cool down, turned off the recording and all that. And I put the SSD, the fan on the SSD, I put it flush against the SSD and I attached it. And I turned on the fan and I was preparing to start recording already when I saw that the SSD light went red for a moment and then turned off and the SSD disconnected from the phone. Like, whoa, okay, what's happening here? Turns out if you overcool, and the SSD was like 4 degrees Celsius or cooler at that point when it disconnected. Turns out if you overcool the SSD, it also will not work. It's like, well, seems reasonable, I guess, but what do you do about that? So what I did was I stuffed a piece of cardboard, just thin cardboard, as a light thermal barrier, and I turned the fan on, and the SSD stayed on for like 4 minutes. I didn't wait past that, but without actively writing data to it, just sitting chill, the SSD did not overcool with a thermal barrier in there. I did a video experiment with that setup, and the SSD only heated up to about 34 or 35 degrees Celsius, which was great. It wasn't heating up to 41. And the resulting video was good. There wasn't any stuttering or freezing. So that was good. And then I tried the same setup without the phone cooling fan, but with just a regular room fan. And the results were also good. The SSD only heated to 32 degrees Celsius, and the phone only went to 35 degrees Celsius. Which shows you can just use a room fan if you'd prefer. And then I was curious, well, is it the SSD? I mean, obviously it is. But what exactly happens? What is the write speed? How much do we lose of the write speed? So I wrote a computer program in C++ to write data to the SSD as fast as possible and measure how much does the write speed degrade when you write more and more data to it. After I ran the computer program and ran that data through this Python script to plot it for me, I saw that yes, there certainly are some dips in the write speed later on in the writing process, and they go as low as like sometimes somewhere between 160 and 180 megabytes per second. So then one final test I did, I made a case out of these crafts materials to hold the SSD and to make it fit inside this foam cooler, but to make it so that it doesn't overcool because there is a little bit of a barrier still, a thermal barrier. And I bought a second phone cooler as well, so one on the phone, one on the SSD. And one note about the SSD holder design, by the way, is my first iteration of the design was covering this side of the SSD as well. And that was bad because it was causing the SSD to overheat because you want some airflow. You don't want to do more harm than good with this case for the SSD. And so that's what I did. I left this open, I left enough padding here for these grips to grip on it, and enough padding here to push the SSD more towards the fan, and it worked well. For the camera app, I know that the default camera app will work with this at this point, and I wanted something better, something with more control. I tried using Pro Camera this time, and it worked pretty well. I used a setting of set the ISO to 50, which is the lowest that Pro Camera will go on the iPhone 15 Pro Max. And I set the shutter speed to 1/90 and the zoom to 1.5 times and the focus to just autofocus in general with autofocus area. And the recording format is 4K 60 in log format. And the result was, it was a good video, no stuttering. I didn't have time to watch the whole 2 hours, 49 minutes, and 38 seconds that it recorded. But with the stuttering issue, honestly, the last 4 minutes or so are the most important. So I watched the last 3.5 minutes of the video and it was flawless. There was no stuttering, nothing. And the recording stopped because it ran out of storage. Pro Camera app, it seems pretty nice. I haven't used it a whole lot yet, only just a little bit so far. I can post an update later if I find any problems with it, but so far it has been pretty good. And the recorded file size in that 2 hours and 49 minutes was just under 2 terabytes. So as expected, it fills up the 2 terabyte SSD, and it should be enough to record a 2-hour event. Alright, so to conclude, the most important takeaway is you do not want a device as cool as possible. That's the wrong way to think about it. You want the device to be as optimal as possible in terms of its operating temperature. For the phone, that just means don't turn the fan on until it's recording. And for the SSD, well, you might need to rig something together or just use some creativity to make sure that it stays at optimal temperature, does not overcool, does not overheat. Now, if you made it to this part of the video, you are smart enough to figure out how to configure things, how to make things the right temperature, and how to troubleshoot your video issues. And I'm sure you will do great things. Thank you for watching my channel, and now go accomplish things. What I can say about Pro Camera so far, I haven't used it a lot, just this one time so far, or maybe